Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. So good evening, everyone. It's very hard to follow such an inspirational talk and to follow such an icon like Edith here. But I will try my best to share some of my current thoughts on queer art, queer spaces, queer spatial constellations and configurations, and queer sociability within them. Before I do that, let me please thank to Julia, Jana, Marta, Matthew, and others from the Center for Modern Art and Theory to having me here tonight. I suggested the queer topic because currently I'm working on the production of a collective book, Images of Queer Desire, Obrazy jiné touhy in Czech, which I edited, and 16 authors of all generations of scholars have contributed to it. It made me think, writing the introduction and going through the chapters again and again and again, it made me think about the links and relations between the queer subject, the queer object, and queer spaces that they temporarily occupy. 2 days ago, I have returned from the International Conference of the Society of Architectural Historians in Montreal, which is a beautiful city. We had a great time, the weather was gorgeous, and I enjoyed that very much. But nevertheless, I clearly enjoyed that. I will try to reference to this experience only twice, at the beginning and at the end of the talk. As almost every year, there was a queer panel chaired by Olivier Vallerand this time, who I will mention again later, who is a scholar and an expert on queer spaces, whom I met already in 2018 when I presented at a queer panel at the same conference. There have been queer panels at these conferences before. I think it was like many years before in Los Angeles, but this was like a first time when it started like a tradition that every year there is a queer panel at these conferences. At that time, back then, I had much less ambitious objectives than I have today. I simply wanted to draw attention to various historical queer domestic spaces in East Central Europe. Today, I want to think about a question: if queer spatiality cannot be a good perspective to look at and to interpret queer histories, queer biographies, and material culture in general. This year, after attending the Queer Spaces panel, this year's conference last Thursday, me and my colleague from Spain, we went for a walk around the city because it was my first time in Canada, in Montreal. When the evening was getting to the close, I said goodbye to him and explained that I want to go to explore the gay nightlife. The next day, the first thing he asked me in the morning at breakfast, with apparent curiosity, was how my exploration went. I, a little bit offended with his indiscretion, made a joke. Come on, what happens in a queer space stays in the queer space. Meaning, mind your own business. But then I surprised myself. Wow, that's actually a pretty deep and multi-layered thought. So from my experience of acknowledging and researching various queer spaces, such as gay bathhouses, gay clubs, like here, drag ballrooms, collective living alternatives, gay bars and gay clubs, gay cruising areas, like here, LGBTIQ festivals and prides, semi-private or semi-public spaces, such as queer artistic studios, and of course, queer domestic interiors, we see that they cannot be defined and that they become queer only temporarily, with a queer present of queer people. They are inherently ephemeral. Their queerness was often disguised under ambiguous codes, and they were disassembled after the queer subject moved away or passed away, either to intentionally erase them or just out of immunity or ignorance to its queer meaning. Plus, using the paraphrase of the slogan, "What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas," as the commercial campaign for a conglomerate of casinos from 2003 goes, it suggests that something that we consider shameful happens there. As Jack Halberstam aptly points out, quote, "Shame is still an active rubric of identification for queer people," end quote, and spatial conditions for queer sex have a lot to do with it. In my talk, I would like to introduce some queer domestic spatial configurations and constellations. I would like to discuss their performative qualities, aesthetics and homosocial and homosexual practice that took place there or did not take place there. And of course, their ephemerality. Secondly, I will try to investigate a little more how that can become a way for further epistemology of queer experiences. In 2017, during my time at UC Berkeley, I focused my research on the personality, writings, and life of Edward Carpenter. I was fascinated by the queer utopia, which included the equality of queer people, the emancipation of women, including, for example, reproductive rights, but also included the aesthetic ideals of the reform movement of that time in Great Britain. But unlike other colleagues from the Socialist League, Carpenter had the opportunity to actually materialize his queer utopia in real space and in real time, because he inherited a fairy tale heritage. Carpenter created the country house and estate of Millthorpe, where he implemented a communal economy for the community of farmers and artisans he had envisioned with John Ruskin, and created a space where equal rights existed for himself, his partner George Merrill, and other same-sex couples, and where he could simultaneously manifest his refined aesthetic taste through art collections and design equipment. Of course, creating your own worlds and queer utopias was possible when you had unlimited funds, like Carpenter did. The relationship to the soil, the pit to the means of production, but also the reformist aesthetics of life became the central theme of Carpenter's writing and life practice. It was far easier for Carpenter to blend in and be accepted by the rural environment around Sheffield than by the Victorian morality of the big city. Quote, railwaymen, porters, clerk, single men, iron workers, coach builders, Sheffield cutlers became his friends, end quote. Thanks to this, Carpenter began to think about his unique system of social reconstruction in terms of socialism, anarchism, and equality of queer people and for women. During my current research at the GLBT Historical Society archive in San Francisco, I came across the lesbian poet and novelist Elsa Gidlow. Elsa Gidlow lived an openly queer life, thematizing her non-heterosexual experience both in her literary work and occasional activism. However, in her diaries, she emphasized queer people's different relationship to home and its creation. Sorry, it's a rather longer quote, but I believe it's important. Quote, I came by my house when I was 40, when for the first time I fully realized the meaning of insecurity. I have never had security in the modern sense. It has a little to do with economic safety. Security, in one's innocence, comes from not knowing what life can do to you. Security, when that knowledge is all too present, comes from not caring what it can do, or being stronger than any turbulation or visitation of fate. It comes from a mysterious kind of faith in life and perhaps not overvaluing one's place in it. The making, or rather the remaking of my house has been coincident with the re-establishment of my life on its axis, end quote. Gidlow acknowledges that queer people's homes are acquired differently than the straight majority ones, simply because a large number of queer people were thrown out of their family houses, disowned, or just had to leave because they could not be themselves in their family homes. And the family estate was not passed on to them, same as passing on the family narrations, natural oral reproduction of memory. She wrote, quote, "We got a tradition in our family. You know that is a tradition. It's something your grandmother tells you she did, so you will do something that ain't natural. I regretted having to leave. It would have been a delight to learn from her," end quote. Gidlow connects the queer reinvention, constant renegotiation of one's identity with the lack of this family tradition, which manifests itself in reinvention and renegotiation of one's space. Later on, in 1954, it led Gidlow to funding a communal living space in the Druid Heights in Mount Tamalpais in Marin County in California. And she created a liberal, spiritual community outside the normative rules. Over the years, there grew a number of cabins in various styles: Japanese, Caribbean, Mayan, Native American, and so on. It became an eclectic assemblage of non-American, anti-modernist traditions, where the aesthetics followed a very specific ethic system set up by spiritual and queer values represented by Gidlow. Both Carpenter's and Gidlow's cases show how spatial conditions and constructing and negotiating one's own space is a core to imagining queer utopias that are, according to a brilliant book, Queer Utopias by José Esteban Muñoz, essential part of becoming different. Because the initial moment of being different is the, quote, failure to be normal. Imagining and creating, if you have the means, of queer utopias are the essence of becoming queer. They were both privileged personas. Carpenter culturally, socially, and economically. Gidlow first socially and culturally. Later on, she created a certain economic capital as well. That sets up one's options and means to perform one's sexual citizenship. The public LGBTIQ activism presence where private becomes political and political becomes private. According to David T. Evans, queer identities and rights of queer citizens are defined by the relationship between the capitalist market, capitalist system, and the state, how they are manifested and controlled in material world. While Gidlow and Carpenter had access to means to perform their sexual citizenship and construct their own queer utopias, there was a large group of working-class queer people who did not. It is very difficult to research the experience of queer working-class citizens. We usually have only repressive documentation that puts them in a position of victims of oppression, and because of the lack of archival documents, we cannot give them their voice. As Karel Hlaváček and Jiří Karásek z Lvovic noted, Sokol organization, which was often visited by working-class citizens, became also a place to seek for homosocial and homoerotic relationships. Perhaps that's why the painting Showers in the Prague Sokol by Miloš became so scandalous. It made the upper-class male viewers to look at nude working-class men's behind, a position that was not traditional to aesthetically admire male body, rather to sexually admire the male body. Thanks to Jan Seidel's research, we have a couple of very superficial ideas of the everyday life of working-class lesbian women. Because it was almost impossible for women to become economically independent, working-class women at that point had 40% wage gap than men. In the first 3 decades of the 20th century, they had to live collectively either with straight women or other lesbian women. Lesbian collectives living in very poor and cramped conditions were usually the only option. For instance, this was the case of the lesbian household in Prague, Michle, where Berta K, with her 2 children and her sister, lived with their 2 girlfriends in 1 room only. In 1937, the movie industry businessman Miloš Havel commissioned a luxurious villa in the style of modern romanticism to architect Vladimír Gréger, who previously worked for Havel's brothers, or for the Havel's estate. Miloš Havel was one of 3 prominent queer figures in the movie industry, Prague, Hollywood, together with František Čáp and Václav Krška. While the first floor of Havel's villa was open to a beautiful romantic garden and a spectacular view of Vltava River, and was a luxurious set of spaces for throwing opulent social gatherings, the second floor was private. Architect Vladimír Gréger first presented a straight version of the social lounge in beige, grey and dark purple colors, in which the focal point of the interior was the fireplace. After a few weeks of consultations with the client, another version was designed. Various ornamental textures and contrastive bright colors were added, and the stage in the previous design, an uplifted area used simply for communication to the chatting room, became the focal point of the interior and lost its communication purpose. On the private floor, the eastern wing was dedicated to the master of the house. The hall ended in a closet which was designed by Gregor and included various furniture, wallpapers and textures. Its connection to the master's bedroom, the hall and the bathroom makes the closet the center of Havel's private floor, or the Havel's private wing. The attention dedicated to Miloš Havel's closet, compared to other rooms, can be matched with what Aaron Betsky describes as a specific space of queer spectacle, a place where queer people, quote, create their own worlds in a secure environment, end quote. As it turned out, the private floor was open for Havel's queer friends and lovers. As actress Olga Scheinpflugová described in her book, Havel used his luxurious, comfortable suite, equipped in the most expensive way, to impress young male lovers. She writes, quote, "In the dressing room, white room with a red rug and a sofa, he opened all the wardrobes with 30 most expensive suits, arranged in a perfect order, piles of hats and pyramids of the most expensive shoes, mountains of shirts and ties, socks, and everything what a poor boy is not supposed to see. He," meaning the young male lover, who's also the character in the novel, "he fell into a visual trance and dazzling wonder by the fact that such a comfort exists," end quote. In the Western Wing, Gregor designed a lady's bedroom. However, no design for the lady's bedroom and a closet have ever been presented, and from what we know, either were ordered and paid for, unlike Havel's own rooms and both guest bedrooms. The lady rooms were supposedly empty for Havel's future partner, but as far as we know, no partner ever moved in this house because Miloš Havel only lived there for about 8 years. Another shift between Gregor's first design of the house and the final layout is worth mentioning as well: the location of the outdoor swimming pool. In the first design, Gregor located the swimming pool to be parallel with the house and to be accessible from the patio. However, Havel made Gregor to move the swimming pool right under the windows of his bedroom and rotate the swimming pool so it was situated upright to the house. That meant he could see the swimmers for the entire time they were having a swim, and that he could see them from the back and from the front, not from their side like in the first design. It was not common to use the swimming pool during dinner parties, so the swimming pool was designed for the male gaze of the house master towards the private male visitors. Although the plans and designs clearly applied to the disguise of the masters and ladies' wings, the interior and the social practice in the house might have seemed to be apparently queer during the Nazi regime. Therefore, Havel came to the same conclusion as Philip Johnson in his glass house and commissioned a wooden pavilion hidden in the garden where his genuine private queer life could take place, and that could not be seen from anywhere, from the street or anywhere next to the house. The apartment and social activities of the novelist, journalist, collector and librarian Jiří Karásek z Lvovic represent a correlation of several queer modern cultural strategies. His aristocratic localite attribute, Lvovic, was actually invented for him, as well as his imaginary aristocratic origin, by his gay friend, biographer and novelist Jędřich Lipanský. Although Karásek became a major figure in the Prague interwar cultural milieu and queer community, he was just a post officer with no noble or wealthy background. Refusing one's own family history and inventing a new one, glorious one, with a sophisticated system of symbols and references, was identified by Whitney Davis as a queer strategy to create aristocratic collections in the 19th and the 20th centuries, which he called the queer family romance. Karásek openly uses collecting antiquities as a sublimation of homosexual desires in his gay novel Ganymedes. The father of the main character, Radovan, the young gay character, who is no longer interested in women, created an incredible collection of valuable objects. Quote, "The walls were covered with paintings, porcelain filled all the showcases, the collection of arms was growing, as well as the collections of coins. One room filled with books, another room was full of plates and engravings and drawings. He used to wander like a shadow around the chamber from an object to another, here enjoying a little Grudas painting, there a little rose on a Meissen cup, end quote. As Karásek implies, the constellation made sense just for the character himself. Karásek's own collections, together with his queer library consisting of Plato's Symposium, Sappho's poetry, Georges Duhamel's gay novel Friendship, Freud's Leonardo da Vinci memory of his childhood, and contemporary sexologist literature, became a reference point of Prague queer communities. As the gay scriptwriter Václav Krška testified, this part of Karásek's collection was accessible at least to his queer social circle. Queer books and artworks were not at one place. They were scattered around Karásek's entire gallery and library, which was made public in 1925, containing various books and artworks unrelated to queer imagery and literary heritage. The flat of the novelist Ladislav Fuks represents yet another example of creating queer space through the temporal constellation of objects with masked, coded meaning. He filled his apartment, which he shared with his mother in Davice district, with insignificant stacks of antiquities, bizarre souvenirs, and campy bric-a-brac, for example, stuffed parrot in a golden cage. Not interested in the value, nor the sophisticated iconography of the space he created, like Karásek, he was rather focused on the performativity of collecting and adjusting his spatial constellation, e.g. hoarding. Creating a queer spectacle in terms of Emanuel Cooper's concept of a strategy, which is by the definition ephemeral, performative, and usually way over the top in its campiness, Fuks identified himself with a female character from his novel, The Duchess, from the novel The Duchess and the Cook. Her task was to create a museum of bizarre objects in terms of the 18th and the 19th century museums of curiosities. The Duchess somehow wanted to transgress the emptiness of her life. Quote, the big gold-plated cage where you keep exotic colorful birds, end quote, which was reconstructed as a symbol in the center of Fuks' own apartment with the stuffed parrot. The Museum of Curiosities in Fuks' apartment, which is described in his novel, had a real inspiration, the Kinjvart Castle, where Fuks worked as a curator in the late 1950s and wrote a paper on this collection, which suggests that he was genuinely fascinated by this collection. Like Karásek's collection, it was a strategy how to appropriate a romantic self-image, the same case of Havel's luxurious villa. According to witnesses, he tried to impress, again, his male lovers, and as he shared his apartment with his mother until her later age, it became the archetype of a spectacle of the closet, same as the case of Marcel Proust living with his mother, which was described by Kosovsky-Sedgwick in her book Epistemology of the Closet, as someone, the mother, who was the, quote, unknowing, disapproving woman who can't know, end quote. As it turns out, all we have got so far is a story of gay, upper and middle-class men who were able to construct a spectacular space, a cabaret, extravagant opera set, the interior design for seduction, in an urban or even cosmopolitan environment, as Aaron Betsky puts it. Where is the space designed, inhabited, or rewritten by lesbian women or transgender or non-binary people? The Czech avant-garde painter Toyen, who I am going to refer to as non-binary, and who was the member of André Breton's Surrealist group and a member of other artistic groups like the Devětsil and Surrealist group in Czech lands, started to run a store where they and their friend and close cooperator Jindřich Štýrský decorated fabrics. Their store at Národní Avenue in Prague was referred to as, quote, a poetry of ladies' boudoirs, poetry filled with fragile tones and quarter tones. It is the mundane template ornament which decorates our women and girls in an original way, end quote. While working in these ladies' boudoir, Toyen lived in an apartment in Krásova Street. It was a studio, probably with a very simple and functional furnishing. From what we know from memoirs and notes of other avant-garde poets and artists such as Vítězslav Nezval and Jaroslav Seifert, they did not host any social and artistic gatherings in their apartment, and they all met in public cafes and parks. Situated in a new building from 1920s, Toyen's apartment can be identified as what avant-garde architects and theorists refer to as the minimum dwelling. On the cover of an analytic book with the same title, written by Karel Tajge, the minimum dwelling was not illustrated with some new radical design of a minimal organization of a living space based on sociometric research. On the contrary, we can see a hotel building, Machnáč in Trenčanské Teplice, designed by Jaromír Krejcar, who was also a member of the Devětsil group. From what we know about Toyen's life, they did not use their minimal flat as a room of their own in the Virginia Woolf sense. They did not do any intellectual or artistic work there. They used it more like a hotel room, where they just slept and performed their sexual life. Contemporary architect Zdeněk Rossmann, who first became interested in women's role in modern living space, referred to a contemporary home as a prison. He published a diagram he called Zing Zing after the infamous American prison facility, pointing out that a woman is imprisoned at home and she needs to liberate herself regardless of the fact whether she lives in a bourgeois villa or a minimum working class dwelling. Quote, "We think it is our responsibility to remind a modern woman that even a glass cage is still a cage." End quote. Toyen became even more imprisoned in their apartment when they took in Jindřich Heisler and hid him from the Nazi persecution in their small bathroom for 3 years during the World War II. Stepping out of the minimum dwelling into the public space, traditionally dominated by men, is a subversive way which is not tragic or militant, but creative and joyful. It was a strategy of other queer women. In Gil Sedláčková's novel Third Sex, there are 2 female characters. One is lesbian and the other one identifies herself as straight. They share a small apartment, which is the setup for all the love drama, which I will not get into here. But it is a very lovely, very campy story. I strongly recommend it to you. The City of Men is a title of a novel of another lesbian author, Jana Matušová. In her concept, the heteronormative structure of the society leads to the internalized failure because her idea of a new woman, which she called Ginandra, radically rejects the all-male dominated system on one hand, but at the same time tries to fit in it. Her ideal, described in the City of Men novel, was to become equal to these men and to be like them. So does it really matter how the queer spaces look like, how they are created, and what material traces or symbolic system they leave behind? Or can we simply use the methods of social geography and map them and classify them according to their inhabitants' experiences? I think queer spaces can be both a cultural product looked at from the creative process point of view, as well as safe spaces interpreted through our experiences with them or in them. Older queer architectural historiography was fixated on queer creators, especially queer architects, and how their queerness might have or might have not manifested in their designs. I will get back to this in a second. The architecture critic Aaron Betsky, author of the 1997 book Queer Space, even went so far as to connect the contradiction and ambiguity of postmodern architecture, the central concepts of postmodernism defined by Roberto Venturi, with the contradiction and ambiguity of the queer imagination. For him, the choreography of sensual pleasures of postmodernism was the same as the negotiation of queer living space. However, we might not look for the causality between creative process and queer identity. Queer subversion may be one of the paths. It is certain that queer heterotopias invite us to reassess a number of essential questions we take for granted, such as who is the designer? Where is the line between the creator and the user? What is the line between the private and the public? What is supposed to happen in the private and the public? What spatial qualities are, for whom they are intended, and whom they exclude, and so on and so forth. It was these questions that the installation of the Venice Biennale of Architecture in 2018 called Cruising Pavilion, Architecture, Gay Sex and Cruising Culture by the creators Pierre-Alexandre Mathéos, Charles Teissou, Rasmus Merup and Octave Perol tried to shed light on. Their social/artistic/ethnographic research on where, how and under which spatial conditions non-heterosexual people. A significant passage was also devoted to lesbian cruising, so that's why I use this general term, seek out anonymous sexual relationships. It showed that issues of spatial qualities, such as light, clarity, or good organization, cleanliness, but also the authorship, permanence, and unambiguity that we look for in high-quality modernist architecture and which are usually shown at Biennale-type shows, completely dissolve in queer heterotopias. Queer spaces, spaces on the margins and outside official structures, have the power of subversion. But at the same time, they are fragile in their impermanence. Gentrification they are threatened by gentrification and also by the current transition to digital worlds. As Amin Ghaziani reports, a recent study in 17 contemporary Western metropolises showed that in all of them, virtual gay communities have outnumbered offline physical communities. What used to happen in the queer space stayed in the queer space. That is now vanishing before our eyes. Queer spaces, according to Betsky, constitute certain aesthetic qualities, however ambiguous and difficult to define they may be. For Joel Sanders, editor of the book Stud, Architecture of Masculinity from 1997, in which he dealt more with non-normative masculinities, not just queer masculinities, but also other non-normative masculinities, we surprisingly read the exact opposite. Quote, "Queer spaces do not exist. There are only spaces used by queer people or intended for queer purposes," end quote. In this concept, queer spaces are determined by social behavior that took place there. Their form or spatial organization, which Betsky focuses on, did not matter at all. The younger generation of theoreticians is still concerned with the description of differences that separated queer spaces from the normative spaces or spaces that are inherently ignorant towards minorities, but emphasizes the ethics of queer spaces. Olivier Vallerand, whom I mentioned before, author of the book Unplanned Visitors, Queering the Ethics and Aesthetics of Domestic Space, urges us to rethink normative understandings of how the categories and existence of positivist truth are constructed, both of what it is to be a creator and what we mean by good practice in architecture. According to him, exclusionary and authoritarian practices do not belong in a better future, and queer inclusivity and participation should be the predominant strategy in all creative and critical areas. Spatiality has played a vital role in the transmission of queer memory because, as historian Kay Davison points out in her chapter Queer Spaces in the recently published book The Routledge Handbook of Memory Activism, unless commemoration takes place in a specific space, it is not visible and therefore can be easily marginalized. Quote, "It is not just memory," Davison continues, "that becomes layered, but it is the space. It is, after all, public space that is being contested. Who has the right to be publicly known, acknowledged, celebrated, and remembered?" End quote. The awareness of the presence of queer people, not only across all time, but also all space, is an important moment for the fight for equal rights. As Davison continues, queer memory has a different relationship to time than mainstream collective memory. The status of genealogical inheritance does not work. Thus, queer memory lacks the natural continuity of generational transfer of narrative, which leads us back to Else Gidlow, where we have started off today. How can a queer space become a historical perspective? That leads me back to my visit to Montreal and the Society of Architectural Historians conference. As a closing climax of the program, a distinguished architectural historian from Montreal, Anne-Marie Adams, who focuses mostly on the intersections of architecture, medicine, and politics, gave an excellent talk. When she got to the closing part of her talk, she shared her current research project with us, a biography of a leading cardiologist at McGill University in Montreal and a medical museum curator, Maud Abbott. However, she is not writing a standard biography, structured chronologically or according to some other traditional key. She is writing her spatial biography. As Adams believes, looking at how a subject inhabited and occupies the different spaces, both private and public, profession or leisure-oriented, creates an image that is not defined by others. It creates this practice, this method, creates an image that is not defined by others, that doesn't define the subject by others, which reduces marginalization, and that focuses rather on the way one negotiated their life with the society, not what image did the society constructed around one's personality. As Adams said, the subject who belongs to an unprivileged group, such as Abbott did, or such queer people did, or such people of color did, is not reduced to a constant struggle and overcoming obstacles and oppression. They are not being victimized, but we can focus on their life choices and their motivations, see them three-dimensionally. In that regard, I think discussing queer spatiality is highly relevant because it allows us to see queer people not as constant victims, but rather as individual historical actors. It sheds light on imagining queer utopias collective or individual, believing in a better future, creating, looking for, and materializing the somewhere over the rainbow here and now. Thank you.